We think of Vikings as raiders and warriors. What rarely gets spoken of is what followed once the fighting was over. When the clash of axes stopped and the shield walls shattered, that's when the true nightmare began. Not for the men left lifeless on the ground. Their pain had ended. It was their wives, their daughters, every woman who survived the raid who faced something far worse. What the Vikings inflicted on them made death seem merciful. You believe you understand Viking cruelty. The sagas barely dare to hint at what came next. If you're interested in documented history from the Viking and Norse period, make sure to subscribe. It helps us continue this work. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. All of this is grounded in sources from Ibn Fadlan's eyewitness writings to archaeological finds at Dublin's slave markets. Now, back to the story. The monastery at Clonmacnoise fell to Thorgils and his fleet. 43 monks were cut down defending the altar. The chronicler describes the slaughter, then falls silent about what befell the women. But the evidence survives. The chains. Excavations at Dublin's Wood Quay uncovered the remains of a slave market. Iron shackles fitted for women's wrists, ankle rings small enough for children, and storage buildings meant for human cargo. Dublin's Norsemen didn't just plunder gold and silver, they plundered bodies. A captured wife became a commodity, not a person. In the markets, the going price was coldly calculated: 20 silver for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 for one injured during capture. These figures are carved into runic inscriptions in Schleswig, receipts in stone. Yet being sold was sometimes the best possible fate. In 862, the Vikings stormed the settlement of Portmore. The Irish annals record 47 warriors killed, but nothing about the 53 women seized in the longhouses. Soil tests from nearby bogs fill in the silence. 23 female bodies, all showing deliberate violence. None of these deaths were chaotic. The wounds followed patterns: skulls fractured from behind, forearms shattered from defense, ribs broken by prolonged assault. These weren't battle casualties. These were executions carried out days after the raid, after decisions had been made. The pattern repeats. In 871, the great heathen army captured Reading. Chroniclers note King Ethelred's defeat, but omit the royal women's fate. Excavations at the old Saxon palace reveal stones stained with iron oxide, blood residue, enough for dozens of deaths. Norse war culture had laws, strict ones. A slain warrior's wife became the lawful property of his killer, not as a servant, but as a forced wife. The Old Norse word was kona, owned woman, property that breathes. Icelandic law codes spell out the ritual. The captor declared ownership before witnesses. The woman had no choice, no voice, no escape. The marriage was legal. Any children born were legitimate. The assault was not just tolerated, it was written into law. The Gragas law codes were explicit. The claim had to be made within 3 days of capture or rivals could contest it. Women were fought over like livestock, and forced marriage wasn't even the worst fate. In 878, Norse raiders destroyed the monastery at Bangor. The annals record its annihilation, but not the ritual that followed. Burn layers at similar sites tell the truth. Bone fragments from women arranged in deliberate patterns. Norse funeral rites demanded sacrifice. When a warrior died, so did his horses, his weapons, his women. Ibn Fadlan describes such a scene on the Volga in 921, the ritual rape and killing of a slave girl at her master's funeral. Archaeology confirms it wasn't an isolated event. Boat burials across Scandinavia contain female skeletons with strangulation marks, drug traces in teeth, evidence of being subdued with henbane before death. They went to the pyre dazed, hallucinating, compliant. Perhaps that dulled the terror, or perhaps it was worse. By 870, the great army wintered at Thetford. Chronicles mention cattle stolen and churches burned. Nothing of what happened inside the camp. The rubbish heaps speak instead. Infant bones, dozens of them bearing blunt force trauma. Not stillbirths, murders. Viking law was clear. If the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. If the child couldn't work, the child was killed. Brutal economics. The Domesday Book later records the practice still alive under the Normans. Population studies in Yorkshire show gaps exactly where Norse settlements had been. The bones at Repton confirm it. The Great Army's camp of 873-874 contained 249 skeletons. Only 63 were women. Women don't vanish unless they are carried away. Isotope analysis of the female remains proves they weren't locals, but captives brought from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Those in graves were the fortunate, dead from childbirth or disease. The rest disappeared into the slave routes. Viking Dublin wasn't just a port, it was a hub of human trafficking. Weekly ships brought fresh captives, women were sorted by age. The young sent to Norse farms as breeding stock, the older shipped east into the Islamic slave markets along the Russian rivers. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings on Dublin's waterfront posts, reveals a story. Continuous rebuilding from 841 to 970. More than 60 years of steady expansion. That growth wasn't for fishing or trade in furs, it was for something darker. The slave markets were thriving. Each new dock meant more space for ships, more storage for human cargo. The warehouses themselves tell the tale. Foundations built of stone designed to hold up to 200 captives at once. Drainage channels carved into the floors, not for stormwater, for human waste. These weren't temporary pens to hold prisoners before transport. They were long-term storage facilities, human stockrooms. Arabic chroniclers of the 9th century described Viking slave caravans that reached as far as Baghdad. The women fetched premium prices in eastern markets. Pale-skinned women from Germanic and Celtic lands were treated as rare luxuries displayed like exotic goods. The Vikings understood their buyers and supplied the trade with ruthless efficiency. If you value documented Viking and Norse history like this, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us. The main eastern slave route wound its way through Novgorod and Kiev, stretching more than 1,000 miles along the Dnieper River. Rune-carved ship manifests have been found listing slaves alongside amber and furs. The figures are chilling. About 20 women per ship, the standard load. But captivity wasn't the worst fate a woman could face. It wasn't being sold. It wasn't forced marriage. It wasn't even ritual sacrifice. The most terrifying fate awaited the women who dared resist. In 914, Irish forces managed to retake Dublin from Norse control. The annals of the Four Masters describe the triumph, the city freed, the Vikings driven out, but the records say nothing of what was found outside the walls. Archaeology has since filled the silence. Excavations revealed punishment pits, stone-lined holes intended for a slow death. Inside were skeletons bearing distinctive injuries, legs broken so escape was impossible, arms shattered to prevent suicide. These women weren't killed quickly. They were kept alive to suffer. Each pit measured 6 ft deep and 3 ft across. Too small to lie flat, too shallow to stand upright. The victims perished, crouched in agony, death creeping over days, sometimes weeks. Viking law codes confirm the punishment. Any slave woman who harmed or killed her master was to be buried alive, but it was never a swift burial. The pit was shallow enough to allow air, but too deep to escape. Victims died of thirst, cold, or exhaustion. Archaeological soil analysis from Dublin's execution grounds supports this. Decomposition layers indicate prolonged death, not immediate burial. Some pits contain sharp stones to tear flesh. Others had standing water to drown the victims slowly. The goal wasn't only death, it was prolonged agony, a lesson to others. Captives were forced to watch, learning exactly what defiance would bring. By 919, Norwegian King Harald Fairhair consolidated his rule. The civil wars among the Norse ended. Expansion slowed, yet the slave economy did not disappear. It became more organized. With established trade routes came reliability. Captives could now be delivered on predictable schedules. Merchants promised delivery dates for people as if they were livestock. Byzantine trade records preserved the details. The Rus-Byzantine Treaty of 944 even lists slave prices by category. Young women commanded the highest rates. Pregnant women sold at a discount. Children under 10 were nearly worthless. The market had rules, calculations, and predictable supply chains. By 937, the last major Viking raid on Ireland came to an end at the Battle of Brunanburh. 5 kingdoms united to defeat the Norse invasion. The victory was decisive, but what they discovered in the baggage train was even more telling. Portable breeding pens. These weren't crude cages, but carefully engineered frameworks. Iron fittings and wooden structures built to restrain humans during long marches or transport. Chains sized for children. Modular sections that could be assembled into larger compounds or disassembled for rapid movement. They were in essence mobile slave markets traveling with the army itself. Each pen could hold a dozen adults or 20 children. Iron rings fixed into the wood-anchored chains in place. Wear patterns show they were used constantly. This wasn't the occasional brutality of war. This was an organized system built into the logistics of campaigning. For the Vikings, war wasn't only about conquest or plunder. It was about harvesting people. The wives and daughters of defeated warriors weren't simply collateral damage. They were the primary target. They were living resources to be seized, processed, and distributed. Archaeological surveys of Viking towns confirm it. Every major settlement had holding pens. Every harbor had processing sites. The infrastructure was everywhere, woven into daily life, hidden in plain sight. In 954, Eric Bloodaxe fell at Stainmore. With his death, the last Viking kingdom in England collapsed, but the networks of slavery didn't vanish. They were absorbed. Christian rulers inherited the infrastructure and renamed it. Records from monasteries describe the rise of indentured servants in massive numbers immediately after Viking defeats. These weren't voluntary contracts. They were the same women, the same captives under a different label, slaves rebranded for Christian markets. In 1066, Harold Hardrada died at Stamford Bridge, marking the end of the Viking Age in England. Yet, archaeology reveals what the chronicles do not. Mass graves of women dated precisely to the years of Viking defeats. These women weren't killed in raids. They were executed, eliminated, evidence erased. The reason becomes clear at Repton. A mass grave sealed in 873 was recently uncovered. 236 bodies, all female. Each bore signs of deliberate killing, blunt force trauma, strangulation, poisoning. But isotope testing revealed the shocking truth. These were not captives. They were Norse-born women. The grave dates to a moment when Viking power in England was collapsing. Norse towns were falling. The women buried there weren't enemy prisoners. They were the Vikings' own wives and daughters. Why? Because the men knew. They knew exactly what awaited captured women. They had inflicted it themselves for generations. And so, faced with defeat, they turned those same methods inward. They killed their own families before they could be taken. Soil cores from the Repton site show the killings were drawn out, occurring over several days. This was not a panicked massacre. It was organized extermination. Fathers ending the lives of their daughters. Husbands executing their wives. A grim mirror of the terror they had once unleashed on others. The chronicles are silent. The sagas do not mention it. But the bones testify. One final detail makes it unforgettable. Carved into one of the skulls was a runic inscription, 3 words written in Old Norse. I'm better this way. During that mass execution, someone paused to carve a message into bone, a justification. Even in the middle of slaughter, they needed to believe they were right. The skull belonged to a girl no older than 12 or 14. Isotope analysis proves she was born in Norway, carried to England as a child, and killed by her own people to prevent capture. The carving was done after death, as if to explain to her or themselves why it happened. The reality is this: Viking sexual violence wasn't random, and it wasn't only about raids. It was embedded into their legal system. The Gragas codes from Iceland spell it out. A man claiming a woman had to make the announcement publicly with at least 3 witnesses present. Her resistance didn't matter. Her consent didn't matter. If she took her own life to escape, the captor could legally demand compensation from her family. Suicide wasn't seen as escape. It was theft of property. The fine was 40 silver marks. To put that in perspective, that was more than most free men could earn in an entire year. By 978, King Ethelred came to the throne of England. His very first decree dealt with Viking slave trading, not to ban it, to tax it. Customs records from London show duties collected on human cargo. 5 silver pieces for a woman, 2 for a child. The English weren't horrified by what the Norse were doing. They envied their profits and wanted a share. Maritime archaeology gives us more detail. Wrecks pulled from the North Sea show specially designed holds, ventilation shafts for air, water stores for weeks of sailing, reinforced compartments built not for cargo but for people. These weren't improvised slave ships. They were purpose-built. The largest found so far could carry 80 captives below deck. Timber dating puts its construction around 912. Burn marks show it went down at sea. 80 women chained inside died with it, and yet some women refused to remain victims. Some fought back. In 923, Frankish records mention a woman named Gunhild. She was a freed Norse captive who turned the raiders' own methods against them. She knew their tactics, their weak points, their fears. For 7 years, she led war bands across Frankish territories, destroying Viking outposts and freeing hundreds of captives. The chronicles credit her with the destruction of 12 Viking camps. Her methods were brutal. Surprise attacks, no prisoners, no mercy. Her last recorded raid targeted the slave market at Rouen. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic execution of every trader she found there. 47 Viking men died. The punishment was always the same: castration first, then death by blood loss. After 930, Gunhild vanishes from the written record. But burn layers found in Viking sites along the Seine date from this exact period. Someone was hunting Vikings, someone who knew precisely how to break them. The practice of seizing defeated women didn't end with the Vikings. It spread. Norman chronicles from the 11th century describe the same custom in conquered England. When William's knights received land grants, the chattels listed included not just livestock and grain, but women. The Domesday Book records it plainly. Female dependents tallied alongside cattle and ploughs. Women were entered as property, valuable but replaceable. Archaeological evidence from Norman castles shows how that system functioned. Courtyards often contained holding cells designed for women alone. Stone walls, iron doors, no windows. Some could contain 30 captives at once. Bones found in castle refuse heaps tell the rest of the story. Infant mortality rates close to 100%. These weren't accidents of neglect. This was deliberate policy. The children born of forced unions carried evidence of rape. They carried liability, and so they were eliminated. 1066 brought the Norman conquest. Harold Godwinson fell at Hastings, and England changed hands. But the new rulers followed the same patterns the Vikings had established. Saxon women were systematically captured and married off to Norman knights. Marriage was the legal framework that turned rape into legitimacy. Chroniclers of the time described it as civilizing the Saxon bloodline. Modern terms would call it something else entirely: ethnic cleansing through sexual violence. Medieval marriage contracts show the economics. Saxon heiresses commanded high prices, not because of love or family alliances, but because their lands could be absorbed into Norman control. Women's consent had no bearing. Their bodies were a tool of property transfer. Church records tell of the resistance. Some women refused and chose death. Others fled to convents. The number of nuns in England tripled in the decade after Hastings. Noble women's suicide rates soared. The church canonized many of them as martyrs. The state listed them as losses of property. The most damning proof comes not from chronicles, but from science. Genetic studies of modern populations reveal patterns that align exactly with the roots of Viking slaving and Norman conquest. Mitochondrial DNA passed from mothers to children tells the story. Celtic and Saxon female lines appear inside Scandinavian gene pools starting in the 9th century. This wasn't cultural exchange, it wasn't migration, it was rape repeated across generations on an industrial scale. In Iceland today, around 60% of female ancestry traces back to Celtic women taken as captives. In Norway, about 40% traces to women from the British Isles. Behind those percentages are thousands of lives, thousands of women taken, pregnancies forced, children born, who never knew their mother's true name. The scope was massive. The system was deliberate, and while chronicles omitted the evidence, bones and DNA preserve the truth. But archaeology continues to unearth even darker layers. At Jorvik, modern York, a new discovery shocked historians. Excavations uncovered the remains of a building dated to around 876. Inside were 64 individual cells, chains bolted into the stone walls. Soil analysis shows the site was occupied for 40 years. This wasn't a prison. It was a breeding facility. The bones tell the story. Hundreds of women cycled through those cells, all showing signs of repeated pregnancies, all discarded when no longer able to bear children. The building stood in the very center of York, not hidden, not secret. Everyone knew. Church records confirm it. Baptismal rolls list 732 births from that site. Only 12 children survived past the age of 5. The rest vanished. The church labeled them foundlings of unknown parentage, then sold them into servitude. The profits went directly to church construction projects. Medieval account books from York Minster even list regular payments to the facility's operators. Not bribes, not charity, contracted fees for services. The church wasn't just aware, it was a partner. This pattern was everywhere. In Norse territories, in Norman settlements, every major town had similar structures. Every church kept similar records. The network was thorough, the profits were immense, the suffering was beyond description. And at Repton, in that infamous grave of Norse women, new soil core analysis has revealed one final horror. The grave wasn't from a single massacre. Deeper layers show multiple episodes of burial over half a century. This wasn't one desperate elimination. It was repeated, systematic, an ongoing policy of erasing women, their bodies, their voices, their very existence. Generation after generation, Viking women were silenced, not by chains alone, but by poison. Bone analysis shows mercury compounds administered slowly, driving them into madness before death. A mad woman's testimony carried no weight, erasing their voices forever. Excavations at Repton reveal mother-child burials, families executed together to ensure no witnesses survived. These weren't random killings, they were targeted eliminations, women who had seen too much, women who knew the machinery of captivity from the inside. And among the skulls, one bore a final inscription in Old Norse. Better this way. A last justification carved by hands that knew exactly what awaited.